Good morning, guys. Welcome back to another installment of Spinner Yarns, where we bring to you stories read out loud by authors looking to promote their work. If you like what you're hearing and you want to hear more, make sure you hit the subscribe and notification bell at the bottom. Also like this video. And if you are feeling so kind and you'd like to support this channel, there are links down in the description and up in the channel bar leading to my eBay, Etsy, Redbubble. It's how I support my daughter and support the writing. So, we are going to be getting back into my book, Blood of the Wolf, which you can find on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find it on BarnesandNoble.com. This will be the last chapter in the book. It is Chapter 12, When Lines Get Crossed. While Michael was in meditation, searching for Ch12, his mind drifted to an old enemy, the Triads. He hadn't thought about them in a while, with everything else that had been going on. So this sudden distraction got him wondering what could possibly be going on with them that would pull his concentration away from his objective, even momentarily. After Michael had teleported Megan to safety, she reappeared a few miles away on the bank of the Willamette River. She called in on her cell phone to let the Triads know the warehouse had been compromised and the mutant or demon that was in their custody had escaped. This was seen as a very dishonorable failure on her part, since she was the one charged with capturing him and destroying him if need be. Her honor was called even deeper into question when Jay's brother Lee found out that he had been killed in the escape. Megan flew back to China for a face-to-face meeting with Lee so she could explain herself. However, when she got there, she found herself in a meeting with the forefathers of the Triads at a long table in the boardroom. They viewed what happened in Portland as something that required all of their attention, and they felt that Megan's part in all of this brought her loyalty into question. Two armed guards approached her from behind, and she began to panic. "Gentlemen, I did everything I could to ensure the demon did not escape, and I followed Jay's orders without fail." Lee stood up, barely able to contain the fury within him. "Obviously, you did not do enough, or we would not be having this conversation, and my brother would not be dead." Megan pleaded with Lee. "Sir, I can make this right. I can find the demon and destroy him, or I can bring him to you if that's what you'd like." Lee smiled arrogantly. "Oh, this demon will be destroyed. I will make sure of it. However, your further involvement in this matter is what isn't sure." Megan was speechless because she knew with a look Lee could order her execution, and that would be it. Lee sighed as he reached down to the Tonto on his belt and removed it from its sheath. "Let us see how strong your loyalty is to our organization, Megan." He slid the blade across the table to her. She looked down at it, and her eyes were wide with intense fear because she knew exactly what he wanted. Lee smiled and nodded. Megan took a deep breath as she picked up the blade. She gulped at the thought of what she was about to do. With another deep breath, she placed her hand on the table and extended her pinky finger. She placed the blade over the top of it, and with another deep breath, she chopped it off. Megan dropped the blade, tensed her jaw, and bit her lip to keep from letting out a scream of intense pain. Lee smiled as he watched a single tear roll down her cheek. "Now how do you propose we deal with this demon once and for all?" Megan composed herself as she focused her chi into her right hand and caused it to glow red hot. She placed it over her wound and cauterized it, gritting her teeth a bit more from the burn. She looked up at Lee and took another deep breath before she spoke. "I will summon the god Quan Ti. He will know where to find this demon and how to destroy it." Lee nodded. "Very well. We leave first thing in the morning. Make whatever preparations you must for the summoning." Lee turned to walk out, but then he turned back. "If you fail again, Megan, there will be no more chances." Megan nodded because she knew Lee was not a man to give chances, and she was only valuable to them as long as she was useful. Michael smiled and shook his head as he pulled himself away and focused back on his search for Ch12. He stayed in meditation for 3 days before he finally sensed Ch12's energy reemerge. Azrael had successfully kept him shielded until now, which made Michael wonder why he had cleared the fog that was hiding him. He could only assume that Azrael was trying to set a trap for him, because he knew Michael couldn't resist trying to rescue Ch12. He wondered what Azrael was planning, but he wasn't willing to pass up this opportunity. Michael contacted Arthur and told him to get the Shadow Wolves ready. We're going after Deathchild, and we may be going to war with Azrael and his forces. He's planning something, just not entirely sure what. Arthur rounded them all up and started preparing them, telling them to expect anything. Once they were ready, he gathered them all in the underground parade grounds that sat adjacent to the exit tunnel. Bloodfang entered the room, and everyone saluted. He addressed all the Shadow Wolves and told them that this was going to be a rescue mission, but to make no mistake, they may also be going to war. Azrael's planning something, and we are most likely walking into a trap, but this is nothing we can't handle. We may also encounter an old enemy while we are out. The Triads have vowed revenge for the death of one of their members at my hands. They've asked Megan to summon the god Ch12 to destroy me. Warclaw and the Shadow Wolves all had a look of shock on their faces. Warclaw leaned forward. She's summoning a god? Bloodfang laughed. Yeah, this could be fun. Warclaw looked confused about Bloodfang's complete lack of concern with a god being summoned to kill him. If you say so. Bloodfang smiled. Trust me. Warclaw stepped back into line as Bloodfang started walking towards the exit tunnel. Move out! All the Shadow Wolves followed and cheered in unison. For the wolf! Bloodfang began leading them to an old abandoned church in Grass Valley, Oregon, over 100 miles from their location. The trip took a few hours, and in that time Megan arrived in Portland with Lee. They began gathering the Triad forces in the area, and once Lee felt that enough of their members had been assembled, he ordered Megan to summon Ch12. Megan bowed and started setting up the ritual. She lit the candles, incense, and herbs to set the sacred space and center her mind. Once she felt ready, she began performing the kata to focus her chi energy as she chanted the summoning spell. As she did this, a dimensional rift began opening in the room. When she reached the end of the summoning, she dropped her arms to her sides and then thrust her hands out in front of her towards the rift. With a bright flash, the rift closed, and in the center of the room stood Ch12. Megan stumbled and fell backwards from all the energy she had expended during the summoning. Ch12 looked around the room, seeing Lee. He instantly recognized him as the one in charge. Why was I summoned? Lee stepped forward and bowed. Lord Ch12, we have called you here to destroy a demon that has killed members of my family and is plaguing the city with its evil. Ch12 looked back at Megan with a look of skepticism, but he was reassured as she nodded in agreement. Ch12 sighed. Then let us find this beast and dispatch it, so I can return to my slumber. He looked around the room. Who was the last person to come in contact with the demon? Megan stood up. That would be me. Ch12 raised an eyebrow. A demon hunter and summoner of your strength, and you could not best it? This is perplexing, to say the least. With a smirk of disbelief, he stepped towards her. Take my hand and show me. As she took his hand, he began to flip through the images in her mind, like someone turning the channels on a TV. When he had finished, he stepped back and nodded his head with a look of interest. Let us go find this demon. With a wave of Ch12's hand, they all disappeared in a flash. As Bloodfang and the Shadow Wolves approached the church, they could see candlelight flickering inside through the windows. Bloodfang gave the signal to move in, and the Shadow Wolves advanced. As they entered the church, they saw a sight that not only sickened them, but left them completely confused. Up at the altar stood a man in a priest's uniform, surrounded by young boys huddled together in their underwear. Deathchild stood off in the corner, shackled to the wall and scowling at the whole scene. Bloodfang could tell that the priest was a vampire, which confused him even more. He approached the altar cautiously, trying to figure out the scene. Finally, he broke the silence with the question that was on everybody's mind. Why? Can't you just eat them? They all heard laughter from the shadows. Bloodfang just raised an eyebrow like he was expecting the laughter. I was wondering when you were going to show your face. I could smell your stench ever since we entered the church. Azrael stepped into the candlelight, smiling like a Cheshire cat. Let me introduce you all to Father Christos, a favorite pet of mine. Bloodfang looked confused. So now you're into pedophiles? He held up a hand like he didn't even want Azrael to answer. Never mind. Church, angels, pedophiles, I guess I should have figured it would all connect somehow. Azrael scowled at Bloodfang, but before he could say anything, there was a loud whistling, and then a pop, like an explosion, followed by a bright flash of light. Everyone shielded their eyes, not knowing what to expect, But when the light dimmed, Quan Ti was standing in the middle of the church, surrounded by Megan and the Triads. Bloodfang smiled and walked towards Megan. You never learn, do you? Quan Ti looked around the room, trying to spot the demon. He had been summoned to kill. Megan smiled confidently. Say anything you want, demon, but you are no match for the great Quan Ti. Bloodfang smiled as Quan Ti turned to face him. As Bloodfang turned in his direction, Quan Ti saw the markings of the Thunderwolves on his armor. He gasped, and then his expression turned to one of anger as he turned to face Megan. You summoned me to kill a member of one of the most honorable and revered races of beings in existence, not to mention the most powerful? Megan stumbled backwards in fear, seeing that she had angered a god. She looked up at Bloodfang in shock, not knowing what to expect. Quan Ti turned back to Bloodfang and bowed. I humbly ask your forgiveness for acting so dishonorably, Great One. Bloodfang placed a hand on his shoulder. No need to apologize, you didn't know. You've never been anything but honorable, even when you were immortal, which is why my people fought by your side and helped train your people during your time on Earth. Azrael started clapping, which caught everyone's attention. Not that this beautiful reunion isn't touching, but can we get back to killing each other, because I'm really looking forward to skinning some wolves. Bloodfang snarled. Oh, I haven't forgotten about you. Quan Ti looked confused. Who is this insolent parasite that speaks to you with such arrogance and contempt? Before Bloodfang could answer, he heard a gun being cocked from the direction of the Triads. It was Lee, who was growing very impatient. I've had enough of all of this. I came here seeking vengeance against the one that killed my brother, and if this so-called god is not going to do it, then I will. Bloodfang smiled, because he could feel the rage growing inside of Quan Ti as he heard that remark. Why don't you show them what a real god is capable of while I take care of what I came here for? Quan Ti nodded, then turned to face Lee and the Triads. Megan looked on in shock and disbelief at what she had helped to bring about. Not only had she angered a god that her culture reveres, but she had enraged Bloodfang for the second time, a being that Quan Ti called one of the most powerful in existence. Bloodfang ordered Warclaw to split their forces. He sent half to back up Quan Ti and the other half to remain with him. As Bloodfang started moving toward Azrael, he held up a hand. If we're going to do this, then let's do it right. Azrael snapped his fingers and Vlad walked out of the shadows, followed by a large group of vampires. 5 angels also emerged from the shadows, led by Gabriel and Apolline. Bloodfang looked back towards Megan, who looked like she felt about 2 inches tall, now realizing where the true evil was in the room. If you want to reclaim your honor, how about you lend a hand? Megan looked up at Bloodfang, shocked that he would even acknowledge her after everything she'd done. She nodded and drew her sword, because she wasn't going to pass up an opportunity to redeem what little honor she had left at this point. As Bloodfang moved in to engage Azrael and his forces, Megan moved up alongside him. Warclaw grumbled, because he'd rather just put a bullet in her head after their last run-in with her and the Triads. Quan Ti and the Shadow Wolves quickly eliminated the Triads and turned their attention to the vampires and the angels as well. Bloodfang pointed towards the altar and ordered Soulfang and his Shadow Wolves to take care of the priest vamp and to get the children to safety. They happily complied as Soulfang raised his cudgel and launched a ray of holy fire toward the vamp, which enveloped him and disintegrated him within seconds. The Shadow Wolves moved in and quickly ported the children outside, as Bloodfang, Megan, and the rest moved to battle. Azrael gave the signal, and Vlad advanced with the rest of the vamps. Bloodfang looked at Megan and motioned for her to engage. Vlad. He smiled arrogantly, assuming, as usual, that this would be an easily fought battle. You send a woman to face me, Wolf? As the vamps surrounded Megan, she dispatched them with a flurry of sword techniques that dizzied and decapitated them, while she made her way towards Vlad. The rest of the vamps moved in, and appeared that they would overwhelm her, but Bloodfang ordered the Shadow Wolves to support her. The added support split the vampire ranks and gave Megan the opening she needed to reach Vlad. She rushed in, attempting to run him through, but Vlad sidestepped her attack and pierced her shoulder with his blade. He grabbed her by the back of the neck and moved in for the finishing bite, to her jugular. Sensing the attack coming, Megan focused her chi and made her skin as hard as iron. Vlad's teeth bounced off, and he grabbed his jaw in a little pain. I won't be killed that easily, demon. Megan centered her weight and grabbed Vlad by the wrist. She twisted and dislocated it as she threw him over her shoulder, slamming him to his back, a few feet in front of her. Bloodfang moved in towards Azrael. and as the angels moved to back him up, they were met by Quan Ti and the Shadow Guard. Warclaw faced off with Apolloin. Quan Ti moved towards Gabriel, while Shade, Shadowblade, Eyeball, and Soulfang faced off with the other three. Bloodfang smiled at Azrael. Nowhere to run this time. You and the rest of these parakeets die here tonight. Azrael sneered and drew his sword. Bloodfang drew his sword off his back, and it glowed with holy light. So bright that Azrael actually squinted a little now, that it was directly in his line of sight. Bloodfang capitalized on Azrael's distracted state, and attacked with a strike towards his sword arm. Azrael blocked just in time, but still staggered back since he wasn't ready. Bloodfang continued to move in with a series of strikes. Azrael continued blocking the attacks, but he was so blinded by the light from the sword that he didn't notice Bloodfang was no longer holding the sword and was only controlling it telekinetically. Bloodfang had moved behind him without him noticing, and as Azrael backpedaled, trying to block the onslaught, Bloodfang grabbed him by the wings and tore them from his body. Azrael screamed in pain and spun around in surprise. Bloodfang snarled and raised his right hand. His sword pierced the back of Azrael's head and exited his mouth. Azrael dropped and Gabriel roared in anger, releasing a blast of energy that sent Quan Ti sliding backward through a few rows of church views. Bloodfang picked up Azrael's limp body and retrieved his sword. He threw Azrael at Gabriel, who caught him and dropped to a knee, grieving over her fallen comrade. You're next, Big Bird. The Shadow Guard had the upper hand, in strength and power, but they were still struggling to defeat the angels. Every time Warclaw slashed Apolloin with his claws, he would get thrown through a wall or bashed over the head with a shield. Shade, Shadowblade, and Eyeball were trading blows with the angels, but the angels were looking worse for wear. Soulfang stayed to the outside of the battle and was shielding the Shadow Guard when need be, as well as launching psychic attacks at the angels when he saw an opening. Vlad and Megan continued to trade blows, and they were seeming to be pretty evenly matched. As Quan Ti approached Bloodfang and Gabriel, he looked past them and saw how Megan was faring. Bloodfang motioned in Megan's direction. I can handle Gabriel, if you want to give her some backup. Quan Ti nodded and made his way in her direction. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. You may think you can handle me, Wolf, but I have slain millions as a general in God's army. You are not the first wolf I've cut down in battle, and I will take pleasure in taking your head as a trophy. Bloodfang smiled. Then bring it on, Featherboy. Vlad slashed down towards Megan's head, but before she could move to block, Quan Ti redirected the strike with his naginata, and then sent him flying through the air with a thrust kick to his ribs. Vlad clutched at his ribcage and snarled towards Quan Ti. Megan dusted herself off and stood next to him, as she looked at Vlad, who was enraged by the interference. Let's finish this, demon! As the melee raged on around them, Gabriel and Bloodfang circled, sizing one another up. Gabriel was the first to attack, thrusting a feint towards Bloodfang's face. Bloodfang pretended to fall for it as he blocked, but then Gabriel spun around and tried to slash to the back of the neck. She found that her target wasn't there. Bloodfang teleported behind her, and with the hilt of his sword he struck the hip joint of her armor and fractured her hip. She grimaced in pain as he danced back, smiling. You're outmatched, Gabriel. Gabriel spun around with fury in her eyes. Her eyes began to glow gold, as did the runes on her armor. But when they did, Bloodfang noticed something strange. The runes were Norse. Gabriel saw his confused look and capitalized on the distraction. A blast of energy shot out of her hand and hit Bloodfang in the chest, sending him flying backwards through a wall into the courtyard. He roared and his eyes flared red as he slapped the ground, causing it to shake as he bounced back to his feet. Gabriel came stomping through the hole in the wall, and as she did, Bloodfang used his telekinesis and dropped the church's chimney on her. Apolloin turned his head and smiled when he saw Bloodfang get launched through a wall, but his demeanor quickly changed when he turned back and saw Warclaw's gauntlet coming in towards his face. He tried to throw his shield in the way, but he wasn't fast enough. Warclaw grabbed him by the face and ripped off half his head. Apolloin fell to the ground, twitching as he died. Who's smiling now, bitch? Soulfang launched a lightning bolt from his cudgel that sent another angel skidding backward and right into a strike from Shade's hammer directed at his spine. It impacted with a loud crack and knocked the wind out of that angel, paralyzing it. As the angel dropped to his knees and began falling backward, he saw another strike from Shade's hammer coming right towards his head. There was nothing he could do to stop it, and Shade's hammer crushed his skull under the impact. Shadowblade was dodging every strike thrown at her, and the angel she was fighting was so distracted trying to hit her, he didn't see Shade moving up behind. As the angel came in for another strike, Shadowblade teleported backward, out of the way. As she did, Shade struck the angel in the back with his hammer, which sent him flying forward, where Shadowblade was waiting. She thrust both swords into his chest. As she slid backward from the residual force of Shade's strike, she rolled backwards, flipping the angel behind her, where she mounted him snarling in conquest, bringing her blades across his neck and taking off his head. The angel Eyeball was fighting was having a little better time keeping him at bay. As Eyeball came in for another attack, the angel threw him through a pillar, which brought a piece of the ceiling down on top of him. Figuring he had Eyeball beaten, he turned his attention on Soulfang, who had his back turned, focusing on the rest of the battle going on around him, and concerned with how Bloodfang was faring outside. As he moved in for the kill, believing he had the drop on Soulfang and hoping to take out one of the Shadow Wolf's heavy hitters, he didn't notice Eyeball teleport out from under the rubble and reappear right behind him. As the angel raised his sword to strike down Soulfang, Eyeball leapt into the air and landed on him, driving both of his knives through the angel's eyes. He pulled the angel backward, kicking and screaming. Soulfang spun around, surprised by the commotion right behind him. Eyeball pulled out one of his blades and stabbed the angel through the neck, and again through the chest, as he continued dragging him backwards. "It's not smart to turn your back on me, boy." He dropped the angel to the ground and watched him bleed out. Soulfang wasn't satisfied with that, though, because he knew that he might still be able to heal from that. Electricity crackled off of his cudgel as he raised it into the air and brought it down, crushing the angel's head with a bright flash. Eyeball laughed. "That's what I'm talking about." As Gabriel pulled herself out from underneath the rubble, she could see Bloodfang standing off to the side waiting for her. "Don't grow too attached to being above ground, because I'll be burying you soon." While the fight between Gabriel and Bloodfang raged on outside, Quan Ti and Megan were beginning to make short work of Vlad, who was barely able to keep his footing as he dodged and parried attacks in a desperate attempt at keeping his head. The Shadow Wolves watched the melee, while the Shadow Guard made their way outdoors to see how Bloodfang was faring. Vlad snarled, seeing his bleak situation, and began to fight with a ferocity Megan had not yet experienced in her battle with him. However, the sudden burst of energy was to no avail. As Vlad launched himself toward Megan in an attempt to run her through, Quan Ti caught him with the flat of his blade and launched him backward. Then he threw his naginata at Vlad, impaling him on it and pinning him to a pillar. Even with the power he possessed, he was no match for a demon hunter and a god. A look of shock and then release from the torment of life as his body began to turn to ash as it crumbled to the ground. Outside the church, Bloodfang and Gabriel circled each other, looking for an opening. Gabriel, confident she could gain the upper hand, feigned an overhand attack with Bloodfang, which Bloodfang pretended to fall for, to lead her in further. She spun her sword around and lunged in with an attack toward his throat, but Bloodfang sidestepped and wrapped her sword arm, trapping it. Then, with an upward strike from his sword, he took off her left wing. Gabriel shrieked in pain and danced back, clutching at her shoulder blade, where a bloody stump remained. Bloodfang smirked. "Guess you'll be flying in circles from now on." She looked down at the amputated wing and then back up at Bloodfang with rage-filled eyes. "You're gonna pay for that!" She closed her eyes and Bloodfang could feel the winds change. A horn sounded off in the distance, and he could hear what sounded like hundreds of large birds approaching. As he looked towards the sky, he saw what he thought must have been 1,000 angels swarming ready to attack. The Shadow Guard teleported to his side, and the rest of the Shadow Wolves, followed by Megan and Quan Ti, exited the church, wondering what the sudden commotion was. Just when it seemed as though the battle was about to get underway, they all heard a loud whistling, like something hot cutting the air. They looked up to see what appeared to be a meteor falling to Earth. Bloodfang erected a shield around the Shadow Guard and ordered the Shadow Wolves to take cover. Gabriel sneered. "Michael!" Bloodfang raised an eyebrow in confusion, but once the meteor hit and the dust settled, he could see what she meant. Gabriel was picking herself up off the ground, and another angel was standing over her with his sword drawn. "I do not wish to fight you, sister, but I cannot let this continue." Gabriel laughed. "You're a little outnumbered, brother." Michael looked up towards the sky. "Oh, I wouldn't say that." Thousands more angels began descending, taking up arms, and preparing to fight Gabriel's forces. Gabriel drew her sword and started marching toward Michael. If this is how it must end, then so be it. Warclaw looked at Bloodfang, wondering what to do. He just shrugged. Family drama. Who are we to interfere? Warclaw nodded and continued watching as Gabriel came within striking distance. She raised her sword, but Michael was faster. He kicked her in the ribs and sent her flying back by 15 feet. Enough! We are Asgardians, Valkyries. We do not fight amongst each other. The senseless war has to end. Bloodfang raised an eyebrow, and then a hand, as if posing a question in class. Wait a minute, Valkyries? Gabriel glared at him. Wait your turn, you insignificant mutt! Michael shook his head. Bloodfang bared a fang, and then raised a hand, grasping Gabriel and binding her in telekinetic energy. I have entertained you thus far, but I am growing very tired of your arrogance. I was created to destroy gods if need be, and you are nowhere near a god. So I will ask one more time, what do you mean by Valkyries? Michael stepped towards Bloodfang, but stopped short when his eyes began to flare. He hung his head and took a breath. As much as I would love to test you in battle, I only wish to answer your question. Bloodfang nodded, and Michael started to speak until Gabriel interjected. Silence, Michael! Our affairs are none of his biz... Bloodfang glared at Gabriel, then waved his other hand in her direction, and with that gesture she could no longer speak. He looked back at Michael with a smirk. Continue? Michael nodded. As the Great War was drawing to a close, and your people were driving the forces of chaos from this realm, Odin and Gaia were wounded badly and needed to recuperate. Gaia retreated back into the earth to slumber, and Odin returned to Asgard for the Odin sleep. To make sure the forces of chaos did not follow, he collapsed Bifrost, the portal between our realms. But in the process of that hasty retreat, we were abandoned here, not allowed to return to Asgard. In the years that followed, the ranks of the Valkyries fell into disarray. We didn't know if we would ever be allowed to return to our home, so we decided to make Earth our home. With no gods left to govern, however, the realm fell under the rule of the only remaining being powerful enough to take control, Christ. Bloodfang held up a hand to stop him. This realm was never meant to be ruled by a single deity. Michael smiled and shook his head. There wasn't really anyone around to contest it. Bloodfang sighed as Michael continued. So when Christ approached us about becoming part of the army, he was amassing to keep the peace. It divided our ranks right down the middle. The ones that followed Gabriel were desperate for a leader and angry with Odin for abandoning us. However, I, on the other hand, as well as those that followed me, remained loyal to Asgard, because we knew that what Odin did had to be done for the good of the realm, and we have been warring ever since. Before Bloodfang could respond, Gabriel regained the use of her voice and ordered the angels to attack. Swarms of angels dove down out of the sky, clashing with Michael's forces as they descended. Bloodfang watched as the melee ensued to see which side would gain the upper hand. Both sides were evenly matched, though, and it looked as though it would be a stalemate. While Gabriel and Michael continued their battle, Bloodfang turned back towards the church to free Deathchild. Some of the angels broke free from the fight and tried to take advantage of Bloodfang while his back was turned. He sensed their motives and gave the order to fire on Gabriel's forces. The Shadow Wolves opened fire, and the tide quickly began to turn. Inside the church, Bloodfang found Deathchild still chained up in the corner. The chains were magically imbued to keep him from escaping, and to keep anyone else from setting him free. Bloodfang shook his head in amusement as he grabbed the shackles, and with the claws on his armor dug a groove through the binding runes, canceling them out. He tore open the shackles and embraced Deathchild, who began to cry. As Bloodfang re-emerged from the church with Deathchild in tow, he could see Gabriel and her angels making a hasty yet labored retreat as they were badly injured. Some didn't make it at all. Michael gave a victorious yell, as did the rest of his soldiers. As he turned around and saw Deathchild, he hung his head in shame. I've seen my brothers commit many atrocities in the name of war, but what Azrael has done to this child is unforgivable. Bloodfang snarled at the mention of Azrael's name. At least he's one that will no longer pose a threat. I just hope I can repair the damage that he's done. Michael nodded as he crouched down and wiped a tear from Deathchild's cheek. That, my friend, is something I believe I can help with. He turned back towards his ranks and called for the angel Raphael to step forward. As the rows of angels parted, Raphael stepped forward carrying a mace that was covered in runes. He had runic tattoos covering both of his arms as well. Raphael's our healer. Raphael walked over to Ch12 and placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked him over and smiled. This isn't too bad. There's nothing so broken that I can't fix it. Raphael crouched down and embraced Ch12, wrapping his wings around him. As he did, the runes on both his arms began to glow, and the light became so intense that had the Shadow Wolves not been wearing their helms, they would have been blinded temporarily. Bloodfang could see Raphael absorbing the toxins like a thick oil creeping up his arms. When it was all over, though, and the glow had dimmed, Raphael stumbled backwards, as Michael quickly caught him. It had taken almost all the energy he had, but it had paid off. Standing where Ch12 used to be was the same little boy, Bobby, that Bloodfang had once healed in the hospital months back. Michael smiled at Bobby and then grabbed a ram's horn off his side, with runic script etched into it. He tossed it to Bloodfang, who looked a little confused at the gift. We have to leave before anybody starts snooping around and notices us. But if you need us, just blow into the horn. We'll hear it and come find you. Bloodfang nodded and gave the signal for the Shadow Wolves to move out as well. He knew Michael was right, because even though the church was in the middle of nowhere, there was still farms within earshot of the battle that may have heard and decided to investigate. Ch12 walked over and shook Bloodfang's hand. It felt good to do battle at the side of a Thunderwolf again. Call on me if you ever need me in the future. Bloodfang nodded as Ch12 turned to face Megan. Choose your rivals and your allies more carefully in the future. Megan teared up and dropped to her knees as Ch12 walked away and through a dimensional portal back to the spirit realm. Out of the corner of his eye, Bloodfang saw Megan unsheath her tanto from her side. She brought the tip to her abdomen, but as she attempted to perform seppuku to atone for such dishonor, she found that she couldn't move. Bloodfang crouched down in front of her and pulled the blade from her paralyzed hands. You may feel that you've lost face by your actions as of late, but you're not going to regain your honor by ritualistically disemboweling yourself. She looked overcome with shame. Then how can I correct this dishonor if not like this? Bloodfang waved his hand, and she was able to move again. By fighting at my side. There are many battles coming, and I'm going to need honorable warriors. You're still an honorable person, Megan, no matter how misled you may have been in the past. He extended a hand to help her up. Will you join me? Megan took his hand and rose to her feet. I'll do whatever it takes to prove I'm worthy. Bloodfang heard the motors from trucks coming up the road. Well, then that settles it. Soulfang, you're with Megan. Time to head home. Bloodfang grabbed Bobby and began to teleport home, followed by Soulfang, Megan, and the rest of the Shadow Guard. In the months that followed, things started to settle down and everyone was able to relax a little. Bobby had no other living relatives, so instead of turning him over to the state, Michael decided to adopt him into his pack. He figured that Bobby would learn more with the learning technology he possessed than any school could ever teach him. And once he was old enough, he would be allowed the option to take the gene serum and join the Shadow Wolves. Michael and Lisa got married the following summer in Forest Park, surrounded by their family and friends. Shortly after, Lisa became pregnant. Michael, Alan, and the rest of the band got back together. With the new resources at their disposal, they were able to cut an album and go on tour with no need to involve record companies. The Shadow Guard followed the band around as their personal security and roadies. Everything was feeling normal for once. Angela even started seeing a man, and they both fell deeply in love, something that Michael didn't even see coming, especially considering it was Eyeball. State and federal governments still were offering rewards for the whereabouts of the Shadow Wolves. They were unwilling to classify them as heroes given the harsh nature of the way they dealt out justice. However, they also knew that they were a group they would have to handle with extreme caution. Michael knew that at some point the Shadow Wolves and the government may even have to face off, but he hoped they could come to a more peaceful resolution. Nevertheless, he was going to enjoy the peace, no matter how short-lived it might end up being. And that is the end of Volume 1 of Blood of the Wolf. Many more to come, so stay tuned. Remember, if you like what you're hearing, hit the subscribe and notification bells down at the bottom and the like button. Also, please follow the links in the description and the channel bar up above. All right, guys. Thank you for listening, and I will see you soon.